Prince Edward has effectively confirmed that Prince Harry and his children, Archie and Lilibet, are out of the active line of succession, and the manner in which this unfolded is paradoxically both more complicated and significantly simpler than current discussions suggest. While headlines scream about a sudden royal earthquake, a careful examination of the statements versus the events reveals that this was not a spontaneous explosion. Instead, it was a slow, quiet, methodical removal that had been quietly in motion for months. Prince Edward merely happened to be the individual left holding the folder when the decision finally transitioned into public view. What is most striking is the widespread assumption that this decision materialized out of nowhere, despite the timeline suggesting otherwise. Prince Edward did not raise his voice or deliver a grand, theatrical announcement from a balcony. He simply confirmed a reality that had already been firmly settled behind closed doors. This is where the narrative becomes peculiar. Let's begin by analyzing Prince Edward's exact wording, because it carries more weight than many realize. He described the situation as a dreadful shock, noting that they were trying to come to terms with it, before confirming that Harry, Archie, and Lilibet were no longer included in the active succession order. Crucially, he did not frame this as a mere proposal or an ongoing discussion. He framed it as a definitive outcome that had already been approved through a confidential crown process. Therefore, by the time Edward spoke, the decision had already been finalized. He was acknowledging an established result, which is a massive distinction. The line of succession, the formal ranking determining who inherits the throne, has historically been treated as an untouchable constitutional bedrock. The assumption was that names could not simply be moved around due to family drama. However, it appears they can be, and they were. The royal who confirmed this monumental shift was, ironically, the one who had consistently sought to avoid the crossfire of this family conflict. It is difficult to observe that Edward felt no sense of triumph regarding this outcome. While his own branch of the family moved up the succession order, a superficial win, the prevailing narrative is that this gain was inextricably linked to his nephew's loss. Edward acutely felt this reality every time he paused during his confirmation. He had spent years actively avoiding the bitter fracture between Charles and Harry, yet suddenly found himself standing directly inside it, holding documents that permanently altered the relationship between his brother's son, his grandchildren, and the crown. This is not a position anyone would covet. Then there is King Charles. Upon receiving the confirmation, the king read it twice and set it flat on the table without uttering a single word. That specific detail resonates deeply because it conveys a profound sadness rather than anger. Charles comprehended the institutional necessity for the change, but he remains a father. The names missing from that list are his son and his grandchildren. The deafening silence in that room likely communicated more than any heated argument ever could. The situation feels even more unsettled because Edward apparently possessed a second, sealed page in his folder. When pressed about its contents, he adamantly refused to discuss them, stating only that the change involved a deeper question of eligibility. It was at this juncture that Prince William was summoned. Picture the scene. Edward closing the folder with both hands, Charles staring at the document rather than his brother, and William walking into a room holding a decision that could either quell the crisis or irreparably tear the family apart behind closed doors. The constitutional language masks the reality of individuals who once shared family tables. This complexity makes the situation strange to follow. It is not merely about succession rules. It involves a father struggling to separate his paternal instincts from his royal duties, a future king confronting the stark reality of his brother's removal, and a younger brother pulled into the fray because his perceived neutrality made him the safest messenger for devastating news. Even more unsettling is the revelation that Prince Harry apparently received warnings about this maneuver months prior. This was not a sudden vindictive punishment. According to the palace briefing Edward received, officials had quietly raised unresolved questions regarding whether an individual could remain within the succession structure while permanently distancing themselves from the inherent obligations attached to it. These concerns were communicated privately, and Harry was reportedly given ample opportunity to respond. Thus, the entire ordeal was a structured process, not a snap decision. Understanding this makes the timeline far more coherent. The crisis did not commence with Edward's announcement. It began during a highly private gathering at Windsor months earlier. During this meeting, Harry was confronted with a demand he deemed impossible, while Charles considered it unavoidable. There were no cameras, no public statements, just one crucial conversation that marked the exact moment reconciliation ceased to be an emotional endeavor and transformed into a constitutional one. During this Windsor meeting, Harry was offered a specific path back into royal cooperation, but he flatly refused the condition attached to it. The palace had been sending him correspondence regarding his formal relationship with the crown, raising pointed questions about his permanent life abroad, his significant distance from royal duties, and whether he would remain available during what they termed constitutional emergencies. Charles desperately wanted an agreement that would resolve these issues without touching the line of succession. He specifically asked Edward to remain close to the discussions, valuing Edward's ability to speak calmly when emotions threatened to derail the process. Charles clung to the belief that compromise was achievable. Harry, however, perceived the palace's demands not as an offer of cooperation, but as a demand for submission disguised as protocol. Looking objectively at the documents he was asked to sign, it is difficult not to see his perspective. The king saw a son attempting to preserve constitutional privilege while rejecting the requisite duties. Harry saw a father allowing the institution to place conditional caveats on a status he believed was his birthright. Edward, observing both men, eventually stopped listening, realizing that mere affection was no longer sufficient to bridge the widening chasm between them. The Windsor meeting served as the definitive breaking point. Charles placed a written declaration in front of Harry, asking him to formally reaffirm his availability for constitutional duties connected to his place in the succession, essentially a formal, binding commitment. Harry read the final paragraph twice, pushed the paper back across the table, and firmly stated he would not sign it. Edward remained motionless. Charles looked from the unsigned page to his son. Harry stood up, making it unequivocally clear that he would not allow his independent life to be tethered to conditions manufactured by the palace. As he left, the king noted that independence carries consequences when constitutional responsibility remains attached. The chilling restraint, neither man raising his voice, made the exchange even colder. Harry walked out, leaving the declaration untouched. Edward remained beside Charles, watching the monarch stare at the blank signature line. When William entered the room, he picked up the rejected document and discovered a stark warning buried near the end. Continued refusal could trigger a formal eligibility review. It was then that William realized this was no longer a pressure tactic, it was a definitive countdown. Months later, that untouched signature line returned to divide the brothers, and this time, the stakes extended far beyond mere reconciliation. William had spent months actively avoiding the conversation, acutely aware of what it might destroy. Harry walked in, harboring the belief that his brother had already chosen the crown over him. There were no aides, no advisors, just the two of them, the unsigned document, and a revised succession order that threatened to irrevocably alter their children's futures. This was not a standard royal disagreement. This was a profound judgment rendered inside a family. William had requested this meeting before the recommendation became irreversible, desiring that Harry hear the grim consequences from a blood relative rather than a faceless official. He knew that once the bureaucratic machinery moved forward, personal explanations would be rendered meaningless. That is the harsh reality of a succession review. It is the formal, clinical process of determining whether an individual can remain within the order under disputed constitutional conditions. Harry arrived under the impression that this was merely another pressure tactic, another attempt to coerce him into obligations he had already firmly rejected. He did not grasp how far the formal process had already advanced. William attempted to explain the inherent contradiction in the simplest terms possible. Leaving official royal work was one distinct decision, but expecting to remain constitutionally available while explicitly refusing the emergency responsibilities tied to that position was another entirely. The palace could not pretend these two choices could coexist indefinitely. However, Harry heard a much colder message. He interpreted his brother's words as hiding a punitive family sanction beneath layers of sterile institutional language. The argument sharply escalated when the topic of Archie and Lilibet was broached. Harry accused William of allowing his children to be stripped of a status they inherited by birth simply because their father had chosen a different path in life. William reacted instantly, asserting that the children were not being judged for their parents' actions. However, he also firmly refused to guarantee that their constitutional status would remain untouched when the fundamental responsibility underpinning it had been explicitly rejected. That reality landed hard. Harry pushed the revised page across the table. William did not touch it. Instead, William revealed a crucial detail Harry had never been told directly. During a private exchange with senior advisors, William had explicitly requested additional time before the review advanced, arguing that his brother deserved one final opportunity to reconsider the Windsor Declaration. That delay had been granted, and the deadline had passed regardless. Harry's anger shifted as William delivered the next quiet truth. It was Charles, not William, who had ultimately authorized the review to proceed. The king had waited until the extension expired and then allowed the constitutional process to run its course. Harry stared at his brother, realizing he had directed months of fierce resentment at the wrong person. He asked if their father could stop it now. William looked down at the untouched page and solemnly stated that he had already asked for more time once, and there was simply no more left. It is a brutal realization. Harry had blamed the wrong brother, and the individual wielding the true power was the one he could not confront in the same manner. Charles had spent his entire life preparing to protect the monarchy, never anticipating that this duty would require a decision that directly impacted his own son's place in the future. The papers were clinical, names, positions, and conditions, but the consequences were agonizingly human. Edward watched as Charles read the final page twice, while William stood several feet away in silence. Then Charles reached for the pen, fully aware that whatever happened next would be recorded in history as both a royal judgment and a profound paternal loss. The succession review had definitively moved beyond a mere family argument. Crown advisors had thoroughly examined the constitutional questions, legal recommendations had been drafted, and formal royal approval now stood as the final barrier between debate and decisive action. In simple terms, it had become an official test of whether Harry could retain his place within the succession structure while simultaneously rejecting the responsibilities intrinsically attached to it. Charles understood why his advisors sought clarity, but he also acutely understood the personal cost of providing it. Edward remained close throughout this ordeal because he had witnessed the previous, failed attempts to repair the divide. He had seen Harry reject the Windsor Declaration, heard Charles plead for compromise, and watched William struggle with the impending consequences. This proximity made Edward valuable as a calmer, less emotionally entangled voice compared to the two brothers. Yet, Edward felt no emotional distance now. Every page of the document served as a stark reminder that his own family would ascend if Harry's position was altered. Charles read the recommendation one final time. Approving it would provide the clean constitutional answer his advisors demanded, but it carried the very real risk of destroying whatever fragile trust remained between father and son. Edward finally voiced the question no one else dared to raise. Can we delay it again? The king looked at him for several seconds before replying that extensions had already been granted, and that every subsequent delay only served to weaken confidence in the process itself. William heard the answer and lowered his eyes. His father was no longer deciding whether action would occur. He was deciding what small measure of mercy could still survive within that action. Then, the sealed clause was finally opened. Charles had meticulously preserved one narrow, highly conditional route back. The decision contained a restoration mechanism, a formal pathway allowing the removed status to be reconsidered if, and only if, strict constitutional conditions were accepted before the revised order became permanently cemented. William immediately realized his father had deliberately kept this option hidden from public discussion. The monarch was firmly closing the door, but the father had stubbornly refused to lock it completely. Charles signed the document, He slowly removed his glasses and placed the pen down on the desk. Edward asked quietly if that decision was final. William replied, "It has to be, nothing more." The underlying meaning was unmistakable. Harry would receive the strict conditions, and whatever choice he made next would belong entirely to him. However, final on paper did not necessarily equate to accepted in the heart. When Harry received the formal terms, the initial consequences manifested immediately. He had braced himself for anger, but he was caught completely off guard by the sheer, profound silence that followed. The revised order was now a tangible reality. The names of Archie and Lilibet were conspicuously absent from the active succession list, and Edward's family had officially moved upward in rank. Back in Britain, there was absolutely no celebration. Edward appeared deeply unsettled by the elevated position he had inherited directly through someone else's profound loss. Charles retreated behind a closed door, heavily bearing the immense weight of what he had just authorized. Harry read the formal notice entirely alone. The revised order had already begun its inexorable movement through the vast machinery of the royal household, forcing officials to immediately amend briefing papers, alter ceremonial planning, and update critical contingency documents used to prepare for sudden constitutional emergencies. This administrative shift matters immensely because it signified that the decision was no longer confined to a single, painful family conversation. It was actively being codified into the very machinery of the monarchy itself. Harry folded the notice once, then slowly opened it again when his eyes reached his children's names. The nature of his pain changed instantly. He could perhaps accept harsh consequences aimed squarely at himself, but seeing Archie and Lilibet formally removed made the cold decision feel devastatingly generational. Then he reached the crucial restoration clause. The mechanism offered one very narrow, highly conditional route back, but it explicitly required a personal, binding commitment to the very constitutional duties he had previously firmly rejected. Charles could forgive him privately as a father, and the king could genuinely desire reconciliation, but neither deep affection nor paternal regret could restore the children's status without Harry actively meeting those stringent conditions himself. That is the aspect that is truly gut-wrenching. The crown possessed the authority to define responsibility, but it could not dictate or mend every human bond. And Harry ultimately chose not to meet those conditions. He accepted the painful removal rather than orchestrate a return under terms he felt he could not live with. Edward acutely felt the same immense weight from the opposite side of the equation. He sat quietly with Sophie and frankly admitted that moving upward in the line of succession brought absolutely no sense of triumph. Their family now carried significantly greater constitutional significance, which translated directly into more intense public attention, heavier responsibility, and a much stronger expectation of absolute readiness should the crown ever suddenly require them. Sophie understood immediately why that new burden felt so bitter. Edward's gain existed solely because Harry's branch had been forcefully pushed away. "This doesn't feel like moving forward," Edward remarked softly after removing his glasses. Sophie answered quietly that perhaps it was never supposed to feel that way. Charles completely withdrew after signing the momentous decision. The monarch had successfully achieved the clear, unambiguous clarity his constitutional advisors demanded, but the father inside him now faced the deafening, agonizing silence that inevitably followed. He knew Harry had received the strict terms. He also knew that attempting to force another conversation might only serve to make the deep wound even deeper. Catherine perceptively saw the looming danger long before William openly admitted it. She strongly urged him to contact Harry one final time, not acting as the heir to the throne, not as the fierce defender of the crown, but simply and purely as a brother. William initially resisted the idea. He felt too much had already been communicated through sterile documents and rigid deadlines. Catherine gently reminded him that this reliance on bureaucracy was exactly the core of the problem. William finally, reluctantly agreed. There would be no aides attending the meeting. No official papers would sit between them on the table. Absolutely no constitutional language would be allowed to obscure or hide what either man truly felt. The institution had already spoken its piece. Now, Two estranged brothers had one final fleeting chance to decide whether the family could somehow say something different. For the first time since the agonizing crisis began, there was absolutely no document resting on the table. No private secretary waited anxiously outside the door armed with talking points. No constitutional advisor was present to interrupt the flow. William and Harry sat entirely alone as brothers, not as the heir and the exile, and the stark absence of the usual palace machinery actually made the raw conversation more painful rather than less. William finally admitted that he had deeply feared losing Harry long before the succession order was ever altered. Harry answered with a truth that was equally difficult to articulate. He had deeply feared that returning to the fold would inevitably mean losing himself entirely. William had deliberately arranged the meeting this way because Catherine firmly believed every previous attempt at reconciliation had instantly failed the moment cold, official language entered the room. Harry already fully understood that the restoration conditions remained available to him. However, accepting them meant explicitly renewing formal, binding commitments to the crown. Those strict commitments would tether him once again to constitutional duties, the very responsibilities expected from anyone who still held an active, prominent place in the succession. William spoke first. He plainly stated that he couldn't ask his brother to return to a restrictive life he clearly no longer wanted, and he wouldn't insult him by pretending that leaving the institution had been an easy choice. But the future king also firmly refused to treat constitutional responsibility as a mere decoration or a casual perk. Holding a place in the succession carried heavy, unavoidable expectations, even if the individual holding it never came remotely close to actually sitting on the throne. Harry listened intently without interrupting. This time, there was absolutely no official bureaucratic language for either of them to hide behind. Harry answered with the stark truth William had deeply feared hearing. Protecting his own family's independence and peace of mind mattered infinitely more to him than preserving a ceremonial position he never actually expected to inherit. He explicitly stated he didn't want Archie and Lilibet raised under the heavy, suffocating obligations he had spent years desperately trying to escape. The decision undoubtedly hurt, but returning simply to recover a lost status would feel exactly like surrendering the independent life he had fiercely fought to build. Then Harry reached slowly across the table. William had deliberately left the restoration folder completely unopened between them, consciously refusing to apply any pressure. Harry placed one hand firmly over the folder and closed it completely. "Leave it closed," he said quietly. The prince looked deeply at his brother and understood the finality of the gesture immediately. Harry would not mount a challenge to the revised succession arrangement. He would not sign the Restoration Declaration merely to recover his lost rank. He would not ask Charles to reverse the difficult decision through appeals to private affection. William nodded slowly in acceptance, but he offered one final, crucial promise. Whatever happened constitutionally on paper, Archie and Lilibet would absolutely never become lesser members of the family in his eyes. Harry looked at him steadily for several seconds before quietly accepting that vital distinction. The crown possessed the power to define constitutional responsibility. It could not, however, dictate every human bond. That quiet agreement fundamentally changed the nature of the crisis. What had begun as fierce resistance now settled into a solemn acceptance. And once Harry's definitive choice became widely known, the argument inevitably escaped the thick palace walls entirely. By the following morning, the story belonged entirely to breakfast tables, loud television studios, massive crowds gathered outside palace gates, and busy newspaper stands across Britain. Some observers saw necessary firm discipline, others saw only cold cruelty. But almost everyone universally understood the same fundamental truth. A line that had seemed permanently fixed by birth had suddenly become deeply, emotionally charged. Edward's quiet, understated confirmation was now undeniably the defining royal story of the day. One specific image captured outside Buckingham Palace perfectly encapsulated the national mood better than any official, polished statement ever could. Edward watched the relentless media coverage beside Sophie and grew increasingly uncomfortable with every passing hour. Broadcasters repeatedly, breathlessly explained the revised succession order, meticulously detailing the formal ranking that dictates exactly who stands next in line to inherit the crown. Eager correspondents focused heavily on his unexpected central role in confirming it, and some overly enthusiastic commentators even referred to him as the situation's biggest beneficiary. Edward rejected that specific language immediately and viscerally. Sophie heard him firmly state that absolutely no one in their household considered another branch of the family being removed to be a victory of any kind. The fierce public argument spread rapidly. Some firmly believed that anyone remaining inside the act of succession should absolutely accept meaningful, binding constitutional responsibility. Others adamantly insisted that an individual's hereditary position should never be altered merely because of internal family conflict or a disagreement over royal duties. Edward completely understood both visceral reactions, but he acutely knew the loud, simplistic television debate was completely stripping away the profound private pain hidden behind every single name on that list. Sophie gently reminded him that the public only saw movement on a printed list. They absolutely did not see the agonizing, heartbreaking conversations that had thoroughly broken the family long before the list was ever officially changed. Outside Buckingham Palace, the public reaction became painfully, visually concrete. A small, vocal crowd gathered near the heavy iron railings as newspaper sellers loudly held up a stark front page dominated by three massive words: "Harry out, Edward rises." One woman quietly read the headline, folded the paper slowly, and lowered it without speaking a single word. Another raised her smartphone and quickly photographed it. That fleeting moment perfectly captured the deep national divide. One complex royal future had been brutally reduced to a sensational headline, while the immense emotional cost remained completely invisible to the masses. Charles heard something infinitely worse on the news. A prominent broadcaster callously described the difficult decision as a king coldly choosing the crown over his own son. The king reached for the remote immediately and quickly switched off the television. He did not attempt to challenge the harsh words. He did not issue a statement to defend himself. He simply sat in profound silence, painfully knowing that whatever sound, logical constitutional reasoning existed behind the decision, millions of people would forever remember the story in deeply, painfully personal terms. Then, the palace officially released the final confirmation that definitively ended the rampant speculation. Through a meticulously documented official statement, it was made abundantly clear that Harry had actively chosen not to utilize the restoration process. He would absolutely not sign the strict conditions required to regain his active succession status. The choice was now undeniably his, as much as it was theirs. Edward read the brief statement beside Sophie and fully understood that the movement on the list was now permanent. Charles understood it too. The rankings were now completely, legally settled. What remained was the infinitely harder verdict, the immense human cost forever hidden behind those newly arranged names. In the end, there was absolutely no triumphant winner in this saga. Edward moved closer to the heavy crown entirely without wanting to profit from another man's profound loss. William fiercely protected the constitutional future he had been raised to inherit, yet had to agonizingly watch his only brother step even farther away from it. Charles successfully secured the clean clarity his constitutional advisors demanded, but he paid an agonizingly high price for it as a father. And Harry made the absolute most personal defining choice of all. He accepted his removal rather than engineer a return under strict conditions he felt he could no longer live with. The line of succession was undeniably clearer. The family, however, was fundamentally not the same. Edward accepted the stark new reality without a shred of celebration. Inside the privacy of his own household, he made it abundantly clear to Sophie and his children that moving higher in the line of succession did absolutely not mean gaining a shiny prize. It meant bearing significantly greater constitutional importance, facing much stronger public expectations, and accepting a far heavier duty to remain ever ready, should the crown ever require them. Sophie fully understood exactly why he spoke with such profound restraint. Their family had only moved forward because another, beloved part of the family, had stepped away forever. Harry made his own monumental decision just as firmly, communicating it through a documented formal response. He officially declined the restoration pathway and fully accepted that his desired independence carried permanent, unalterable constitutional consequences. The restoration pathway was the absolute final mechanism that could have allowed his active position to be reconsidered if he had agreed to accept renewed binding obligations. He definitively chose not to. Archie and Lilibet would permanently remain outside the active order. But Harry firmly believed that fiercely protecting the independent life he had painstakingly built for them mattered infinitely more than recovering a symbolic place in a rigid system he no longer wished to serve. William understood the immense cost from an entirely different direction. The prince had successfully protected the future structure he firmly believed the monarchy required to survive. Yet absolutely nothing about that difficult achievement felt remotely like a victory. His final, highly private conversation with Harry had certainly not repaired everything that was broken between them. But it had successfully prevented a bitter constitutional disagreement from devolving into a total, irreparable personal rejection. He could not magically restore his brother's place without the required conditions. He could, however, still stubbornly refuse to treat him as someone completely erased from the family's heart. Charles carried the absolute hardest, most agonizing reminder of all. The king returned alone to the quiet room, and the unsigned Windsor Declaration that had originally triggered the entire cascading crisis. He gently touched the empty signature line just once, then slowly, deliberately placed the document inside a private drawer. He absolutely did not destroy it. That specific choice mattered immensely. The monarch formally accepted that Harry would never return under those terms, but the grieving father adamantly refused to erase the physical evidence that a reconciliation had once been genuinely, desperately attempted. Edward's quiet confirmation now meant something significantly larger than mere movement on a printed list. Birth had originally created a place in the succession, but in this specific, modern chapter of royal history, continuing responsibility ultimately determined whether that place remained active. Harry decisively chose independence. Edward solemnly accepted an unexpected heavy burden. William accepted the profound loneliness of his inheritance. Charles painfully learned that even a powerful king could not perfectly preserve every single familial bond while simultaneously protecting every ancient institution. Edward's announcement may have changed the order of names on a piece of paper, but its deeper, enduring legacy was painfully simple. The crown ultimately endured because each man involved finally accepted the heavy price of the life he had chosen, and that shared acceptance is what made the difficult decision truly final.